We're a little bit late in kicking off, for which I apologise. It's partly my fault because I was late, but it's actually Michela's fault. Because the reason I was late was I was so absorbed in reading her new book on Kenya that I failed to get off the tube at Paddington and continued to Royal Oak and had to turn round. So please blame her. Thank you all for coming out on a really grisly, wet night, but I think you made a good decision because we've got a very good and interesting panel here tonight to discuss Kenya 1 year on, have the wounds healed. What I think we'll do is, let me introduce the panel first. First of all, Michela, whose book, It's Our Turn to Eat, about corruption in Kenya, has just been published, and you will have opportunities to purchase this book, which you will want to do at the end of the session. Then on her right, Joseph Warungu will be a very familiar voice to any of you who listen to Focus on Africa or other BBC Africa Service programs, just back from Kenya. Professor John Lonsdale, a very renowned historian, particularly of the Mau Mau period, and Martin Kimani, who is a regular columnist for the East African, right, the newspaper which covers Tanzania, Uganda, and Kenya from Nairobi. What I'm going to do is I'm going to get Michela to talk first for about however long she wants to, 5-10 minutes, and then get the others to respond, and then we'll open it up and have a discussion. So let me pass to you first, Michela.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, anyone who has read the back of my book, and there's no reason why that should be you, will know that this book was basically prompted by an event that happened in February morning when John Githongo, who was the serving permanent secretary in charge of ethics and governance in Kenya, suddenly turned up in London and came to stay with me and was on the run because he had decided that he could no longer do his job. He had discovered that there was a massive scandal going on called Anglo leasing. And having repeatedly tried to bring it to the attention of the presidency, having repeatedly tried to do what he could to stop it, and realized that in fact he was playing a fool's game because in fact, all his closest ministerial colleagues were involved. He'd decided that his position was untenable. The death threats had been building up, and he had gone on the run. And so I find myself in this very strange and interesting situation, which had certainly never happened to me before as a journalist, of giving succor, a haven, or whatever, a hiding place for a while, it was a brief 2 weeks, to somebody who was at the heart of a very important news story, and one that I minded a lot about because I had lived in Kenya and regarded it as a second home and had followed the events there quite closely. In the following years, John drew up a dossier, and eventually that dossier was leaked to the press and went public, in which he exposed Anglo leasing. And I thought this was a fascinating story because for the first time in Kenyan history, Kenya has seen, like many African countries, has seen corruption scandal after corruption scandal. There had been Goldenberg before, there have been many in the last few years. And the problem always with corruption is that people make claims, they never have the evidence. And so there is a widespread culture of impunity where everyone knows that certain people are corrupt and they have been on the take and they can see the result in the big houses and the nice cars, but nobody ever has the evidence. And what John had done, and this makes him fairly unusual and also an object of huge controversy in Kenya, was that he had taped the conversations in which his ministerial colleagues had basically told him to stop digging, listen, this is for us, we're raising party election funding, and by the way, since you're a Kikuyu and we're Kikuyus, why are you making such a big fuss? And that's why I call this book It's Our Turn to Eat, because it basically refers to this mentality which you find in Kenya, but you also find in many other African countries, which is that it's our turn at the trough, and the turn is being allotted on an ethnic basis, in this case the Kikuyu and their allied Meru and Embu, so this is the way that it is done in Kenya, and it's our turn. So stop, don't get in the way of the gravy train. I sort of felt in many ways when I was writing this book that it was becoming an old story because everyone knew who was responsible for Anglo leasing. The names had been named. And I went to Kenya in December 2007 thinking, oh, I'll just sort of spend a couple of days and cover the elections and then that's it, that's the book done. Time to get it out fast. And I think what the debacle that was the elections in Kenya, a very frightening and bloody and worrying debacle, suddenly made me realize that actually John Githongo, who'd been for years warning me and telling me, no, this isn't just about corruption, this is about violence, and this is about the falling apart of the state. And Kenya is becoming a very dangerous place because of this it's our turn to eat philosophy. I suddenly realized that John was right, and I stayed. I covered those very frightening events that took place. And I think there are at least 2 or 3 people here who spent a lot more time in Kenya recently than me, and they have a very, these wounds have not been healed. We saw terrible things happening in Kenya during that election and after it. The wounds are very deep, very worrying, and they're not healed. So I guess my conclusion ending this book was, this is not just about corruption. And when our own governments support governments, African governments, and think, oh, it doesn't matter too much because they're stealing a bit, but development, the growth rates are good, development's taking place. In the end, this is a nonsense. So that's my presentation.
Thank you very much, Michela. I'm actually going to turn to you now, Martin. Maybe can you give us some idea from your perspective of how this works, the connection between corruption and violence in Kenya? Why do the two things go together?
Well, thanks, Lindsay. It seems to me that if I was to react to that in terms of what Michela was talking about, is that to a certain extent, and in fact to a very large extent, you seek political office in Kenya so that you can have a chance to defraud the public purse. This is part of the reason you go into the game. And if that's not the reason you go into the game, it becomes the reason you stay in the game so that you can defraud or perhaps abet the defrauding. It's very, very difficult to actually be in government in a high position and not be part and parcel of this particular way of doing things. Now, having said that, I have the sense that the issue is not so much corruption, because in fact, if we're in London, and there's a great deal of institutionalized corruption here, that's why your economy is close to collapsing. So the issue is not so much corruption, but how corruption is related to the public sphere and how corruption is related to public service. And so that the problem is actually the way this issue of corruption interacts with public life. And that is to say that the stakes are so high that the entire thrust of political life is to protect your patch of ground so fiercely, even if you need to rig an election, even if you need to get rid of an opponent, you do it. And what you get to win is the chance to defraud the government. But I'll just finish by saying that there's something, because I just noticed the former High Commissioner to Kenya, Edward Clay, is in the audience. And there's something about one famous comment he made about the Kenyan political elite vomiting on people's shoes, Kenyans and donors. And your book is also called It's Our Turn to Eat. There's a kind of motif here of eating, a kind of sense of appetites that are out of control, which in one way very easily dovetails with a very particularly racist way of thinking of Africans as people whose appetites, bodily appetites, are uncontrollable. But that's, of course, not what you're doing with this book. And I don't think that's what the comment was about. But what I'm trying to say is that there's something about the story of Kenya. Its meaning for Kenyans and its meaning for the world can diverge in very subtle but very important ways. And so my issue here is not to defend eating, because in fact we call it eating. Yeah, we're going to eat. and that's what we call it ourselves. But it's very important for us to understand whenever, if we're critiquing, we need to critique this with a great deal of subtlety, because it's very easy to get lost in the way these words are used and understood.
Okay, thank you very much. There are 3 seats at the front here, so if people who've just come in would like, if 3 people would like to come and sit in the front row, that would be great. And then there's some other seats sort of in the middle as well, so if people want to move, now is a good time to do it. Great. Yeah, maybe people can move along the rows and so allow the newcomers to get in. Okay, great. So thanks very much for that. Joseph, you've just come back from Kenya, so maybe you can give us a bit of an update, because some of us, like me, for example, have not been following it as much in the last few months as we did, obviously, a year ago. So tell us where we are at now, what's happening in the government, what's happening in the, as it were, the 2 governments, the Prime Minister's government and the President's government, and how is this working? Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks very much. First of all, I've read the book, I've enjoyed it, but the only thing I would say, Michela, is that it's already out of date, and I'll tell you why. And I like the way you reminded us about the fancy names that we come up with for eating. We only had one dull example with the maize scandal. We've got Goldenberg, Anglo Leasing, and the latest is Triton. This is a scam where Kenya faces the risk of losing billions of shillings through Kenya Pipeline Corporation deal that has gone very, very badly wrong. And sadly, some of the characters in this particular scam, the very late, we don't say the latest one, the latest that we know of, because there could be a lot more, are actually some of the people who feature prominently in the book. So that's one of the first things that's going on. The other thing is that the government has just now formed this constitutional review team. A lot of Kenyans will tell you this is another complete waste of time. The other exercise costed over 4.5 billion shillings through the referendum. We've got to do it all over again. And exactly what people said 10 years ago is what they're going to say now. But we have to go through it all over again because we want a new constitution. So that's just been announced in the last few days. The other thing that's happened is that some of the people who perhaps were looking whiter than white, they're actually darker than myself, are really are being named in very scary people who we thought we could trust to sort of do the business in the House. Certain MPs, I shall not name names, but they're already being tarnished. Lots of sort of scandals of the immigration. Basically, everywhere you look, if you actually just dig up Kenya and you look at corruption, you could do a thesis there. And then finally, the other thing that's happening is the president has come out today to remind Kenyans that he's got only one wife and 4 children. He called a press conference a matter of national importance. And some of my Kenyan friends say, if this man who's not in charge of his own family, and then he's in charge of 35 million people. So, there are lots of problems there. Now, back on a very serious level, I think the thing that's worrying me personally, from my observation, I spent the whole of February back in Kenya, is that we thought there was a new government which came to refight corruption. Actually, what's happening is a realignment of eaters. It's people, who would ever have thought that someone like Ruto, who was, amongst other people, right at the heart of some of the violence that went on, or named as one of the people who was behind that alongside other people, would go hand in hand down the aisle with someone like Kiraito, some of the very staunch PNU or Kibaki supporters. But they've got to do this. These are the people who teamed together to save his neck when, a censure motion came up in Parliament. Unfortunately, no one is absolutely interested in Anglo-leasing or corruption. Everyone is absolutely focused on 2012. It's a realignment of what happens after that, because there's a succession game going on. Kibaki, he cannot run another term. Well, he could do a Malawi on us, but not yet. Which means that some of the people within the PNU, some of the the Kikuyu elite are fighting very, very, very hard. And corruption is the last thing that anybody wants to think of. And who knows, maybe they're just trying to gather money for that. And then sort of the other, maybe last point that I would like to make, which I also found very worrying, is that there's such level of deep-seated anger within the Kenyan community. I've never seen it this bad. There was a very telling example where religious leaders openly told Raila Odinga and President Kibaki that we cannot have this. You've completely reduced us to whatever level it is, the lowest of the low. I was having my mobile unlocked in a little shop up somewhere a few weeks ago, and it was just soon after the famous fire at this Nakumatt supermarket. And I overheard people down there in a little restaurant where your people who are looking for sort of a meal of about under 50p or something would gather, and they were talking about the fire, and they say, why hadn't that, we wish that fire actually, took place in Parliament. That is the level of, and everyone in that community was kind of, in that conversation was kind of, cheering up to that. There is such deep resentment about politicians, people are losing hope, and then there's a certain level of helplessness. Insecurities begin to creep in. I'm afraid that Mungiki is back in action, or maybe they're polishing their game. So it's a very worrying situation. And unfortunately, whichever way you look at, before I was in Kenya through the multi-party struggle in the early 90s, and then you had a very strong civil society, you had a very strong media. The institutions in Kenya have now been destroyed. The media is so weakened. The media themselves are eating, unfortunately, because the kind of caliber of reporters that we have in some of the media houses are paid so badly that they're now feeding off the hands of the politicians whom they go to cover. So you cannot rely on the media to lead this fight. The religious leaders had their own problems with credibility. And the politicians, it doesn't matter whichever party you look at, is a completely gone case. So Kenyans are sitting and waiting and wondering, does Obama have a spare brother who could kind of come in and help us? I don't know, but things are really looking bad, and there's such level of deep resentment and anger that I've never seen in Kenya. It's just going to take the wrong match to be struck, and you'll have a whole situation erupting. People have got nothing to lose, I get the sense.
That's a very bleak outlook, I'm afraid. I'm going to turn to Professor Lonsdale now, who can maybe give us a bit of a historical perspective on this, but you also were in Kenya in January, so you can give us your impressions.
Thank you very much, Lindsay, and thank you for Michela for producing a book which does actually give us evidence for what many of us had always thought we had glimpses of, but never quite understood and never were quite able to put fingers on. You have very bravely, with the help of John Githongo, put your finger on a great many aspects of contemporary Kenya life, which I understand that the book is not on sale in Nairobi, that no bookshop will stock it, and one can well see why. Because it tells far too many truths about people who would prefer truths not to be spoken about them. Yes, I had the very good fortune to be in Nairobi about 5 or 6 weeks ago for a conference which, in a very naive kind of way, asked how far historians could help to pour oil on currently troubled waters. And I would absolutely support everything that Joseph has said about the sheer terror with which most Kenyans now view the future and their sense of helplessness about it. Everybody knows that the next elections will replay tenfold the kind of violence that we saw last year. There is this sense of powerlessness. Anger is there certainly, but I think it's the sense of helplessness that I sensed more than anything else amongst the various friends with whom I spoke. Now, why should there be this sense of helplessness in face of governments which every Kenyan knows are corrupt, self-seeking, interested principally in lining the power holders' own pockets rather than in anything that you might call development? It is, of course, because it is very difficult indeed to mobilize anything that you would call public opinion in Kenya. The public have an opinion, but it is terribly easily divided between members of different ethnic groups in different parts of the country, speaking different languages, with a very keen and anxious eye on their own land, which historically is theirs. And of course, one of the consequences of misgovernment in Kenya, and this has gone on for years and years, is that there is nothing other than land that people can look to as an asset to exploit, or as a way of earning an income or of conserving a future. And it's something, therefore, that people look on with increasing anxiety and insist that what is historically theirs is to be denied to others. And this, I think, is the most serious connection between corruption and violence, that Kenyans have nothing other than land, or very few Kenyans have anything other than land to look forward to as a means of an income, as a means of security, as a means of endowing their posterity, their children and grandchildren. And there is this appalling, therefore, contraction of ambition on to one's own particular patch of land, to which other people, and Kenya's, of course, population has been growing at the rate of between 2 and 3% per annum, doubling every 25 years, I think, again for the last half century. And Kenya's land does not increase. Indeed, it decreases in its viability as forests get cut down, as watersheds dry up, and so on. So that, it seems to me, is the basic connection between misgovernment, corruption, and violence, this focus on the land. And it does mean that Kenyan public opinion is very easily fragmented into different regional blocks. And while all Kenyans can agree on what ails their society and can very easily pin the blame on misgovernment, nonetheless, there is also this sense that, given that there are very few Kenyans now, except perhaps those who live outside the country, including our two speakers here, that there is a sense in which public opinion is contracting into smaller elements. One of the things which most disturbed my colleagues in the universities of Nairobi and various other universities in Kenya was the way in which people's social arenas were shrinking. That you went to school naturally at a local primary school, walking barefoot several miles, but increasingly people are going to local secondary schools as well, in which the teachers are members of their own ethnic group, very often teaching them in their own ethnic language. Moreover, those few who have the good fortune to go to university are increasingly going to universities which are also regionally focused and again staffed with local people, so that even well-educated Kenyans are increasingly apparently being produced in very small social circles indeed, in which other Kenyans are outsiders, people whom they have not previously met and interacted with. Of course, this is not true of the increasing number of Kenyans who live in cities and in slums, although I believe even in slum areas, which one had previously thought of as being ethnic melting pots, increasingly local villages of one ethnic group or another are springing up, separated from other slum dwellers. So there is this shrinkage of a sort of sense of public community, of political morality into ever smaller social circles in which you rely on your own big man to take as much of a bite out of the national cake on your behalf as you hope, but very few poor people do in fact benefit, I think, from corruption. But there is always the sense that you have to have your own big man in government. This costs money, and corrupt practices, if they produce the kind of money that can convince a coalition government that you're worth having on board because of the public opinion which you can bring with you, then corruption is actually utilitarian to the view of the locality, however much one may in principle regard all holders of power as eaters of the national good. Nonetheless, if one's own big man gets a slice of it, then at least you have the probably illusory impression that you will not be marginalized as others are. It's the terror of being marginalized, of being left out of power, of not having the power to defend your own land, that I think drives a great deal of public opinion. So there is this terrible irony that there is this deep anger at the way in which politicians behave. There is this local self-interest that one's own politician, one's own big man, should nonetheless do quite well out of it.
Thank you very much. Before I open up, I wanted to ask Michela a question. Your book centers around John Githongo, who was appointed as the presidential advisor on corruption, who did everything he could to root it out, who fled and who failed, and who then exposed it all. What has happened to him? What is he doing now?
He's actually in Britain at the moment, but sadly couldn't make it tonight. I just attended a breakfast which he was addressing this morning. He started going back to Kenya after a long break, after the coalition government had been formed, that was formed under Kofi Annan's aegis, and these elections. I think he felt that the formation of a coalition government changed things for him, but he was also extremely, he was homesick, to be honest. He didn't find academia to his liking in a permanent sense. I think he dabbled in it, but realized it wasn't for him, and he wanted to go home. And I also think he felt that there was a growing crisis coming, and that he wanted to play his part, having not been there when the election debacle happened. So my understanding is that he's spending a lot of time in slums, actually, in the slums of Nairobi and Mathare. He's also doing a lot of traveling around the troubled areas where we saw a lot of violence, the Rift Valley and in Kisumu, talking to people, grassroots organizations, and the kind of people that were personally involved in the violence that broke out. And I think his feeling now, I mean, I'm speaking because I heard him speak this morning, is he was saying, we in the anti-corruption movement, he was someone who worked for Transparency International, this anti-corruption organization. And he was, he sucked at the breast of the anti-corruption, the universal global anti-corruption movement, and learnt the principles of fighting corruption. And one of the principles is corruption starts from the head down. So you have to go in at the top. And to be the permanent secretary in State House obviously was exactly that position. Tackle it, at the top, if you've got the president's ear, if you've got the ministers on board, and then it withers. And he was saying that his own personal experience, he feels, has taught him that that's actually completely the wrong approach, because you're expecting the people who are perpetrating this mass corruption to basically destroy themselves. And people don't tend to do that. It's just, not human nature. And he's saying he now feels convinced that you have to go to the grassroots level and mobilize people, and that there are, in fact, in countries like Kenya, a huge number of grassroots organizations, local NGOs. We're not talking about sort of Western-run or NGOs going in. Local NGOs, church groups, civic organizations who are basically sending the message up to the leaders saying, we are fed up with this way of running the country. We are fed up with the way you administer justice and government in this country. Now, I'm not saying that this is my view of things, but this is the approach that he's taking, and he's gone back to try and do what he can as part of that. And I will watch it with interest. I'm just a journalist and an observer. I don't fight the good fight, but I'm interested to see these changes that he's going through, because I think these are things that the anti-corruption movement is trying to learn, and the experience of people like John Githongo is very interesting. Sorry, I'm nearly finished. Interestingly enough, at this breakfast I was with, another African gentleman was there who's called Nuhu Ribadu, and he has taken John Githongo's place in a way at St Anthony's College in Oxford. And Nuhu Ribadu is the John Githongo of Nigeria. He's a former policeman. He didn't have exactly that same position, but he also has been fighting corruption in Nigeria. And like John Githongo, he came a cropper and was basically moved sideways, taken out of his position, dropped, and ended up feeling that his life would be a lot safer if he left for a while and moved to Oxford. So John's experience is just one of the many experiences that are happening across Africa as people try and learn how to fight corruption on the continent.
Thanks very much. Let's open it up now for questions from the floor. Has anybody got a question? No, it is an audience of silent people. No, here.
Question for Professor.
Maybe you can say who you are.
Mike Forbes. It's always always amazed me that violence hasn't broken out in Zimbabwe so far, where it has in Kenya and what might be seen as similar election circumstances. Can you think why it shouldn't have broken out in Zimbabwe? Would you link this to land tenure again or not?
Of course, it has broken out in Zimbabwe, and it was organised by the government. And
one-way process.
Indeed, a very much more ruthless government in Zimbabwe than in Kenya, and I think that anybody in Zimbabwe who thought that they were going to oppose Mugabe would have had another thing coming after the Gukurahundi, the notorious, really punitive expedition, to use a colonial term, that Mugabe launched on Matabeleland very shortly after majority rule in 1980. The Kenya government is a very strange government in that it appears to adhere to all sorts of international norms of proper behavior, and never quite, although its army and its general service unit, the hitmen of the police, are notoriously well, I'm not sure whether ill-disciplined or whether they got orders to terrorize or not. But there is always a sense in which they're never quite released to wreak as much havoc as they might, and there are then ways in which legality appears to be restored. It's a very it's a government which does seem to have a sufficient regard for international norms that it has this kind of sort of Teflon characteristic. People talk about the culture of impunity, which is correct. People never quite pursue those who appear to be guilty of whether one is talking in Western liberal terms of hate speech or actual incitement to mass murder, as I think that one or two politicians could certainly be accused of for what they were up to a year or more ago. They invite commissions of inquiry whose reports are then repudiated, but nonetheless have the capacity apparently to defuse such opposition as was beginning to gather. It's a very sophisticated government in many ways.
Thanks very much. I shall abuse my position as the chair to make a comment myself, which is to say that violence doesn't break out, does it? Violence is whipped up or instigated. One thing about Zimbabwe is that the MDC has been extremely clear that it does not want its youth to do that. And it's an extraordinary tribute to the MDC that it has managed to maintain that, because there has been very little violence by people who are thoroughly provoked. They haven't done it. So I would say that would be one reason. Yes, gentlemen, there, yeah, there's a microphone. I don't think my microphone works, by the way, but I don't think it matters because I've got such a penetrating voice.
My name is Mark Ashurst from the Africa Research Institute. I have just a very quick question for the panel, if if that's all right for everyone, and then a question for Professor Lonsdale. For the panel, it's just, I have very great respect for John Githongo. It's not a negative question in any way, but I wonder if it isn't in some way deluded that he might reinvent himself as a populist political leader and some kind of representative of all that he seeks to be in the slums and among the most desperate people. I can see how someone like that might emerge and inevitably will emerge at some time, but isn't it fanciful to imagine that that person is John Githongo for a whole lot of reasons? I say that with great respect. That's my opinion, but I wonder what the opinion is of the panelists. And my question for Professor Lonsdale, you mentioned that the communities of interest, the social groups, if you like, are shrinking, and that's a very alarming prospect. But then you said that you thought that wasn't happening in the cities, which is a huge exception. That's a huge qualification. And I found actually one of the very positive things in Michela's book were the sections on Seong, the slang language which is not in any way ethnic, and it did start to become ethnic in 2008 and kind of rebounded again and stopped being ethnic. I was there a month ago and people said that Seong had kind of recovered from the blow, if you like. And I also found the bit on the graveyards quite encouraging, that there are now more people who identify with Nairobi and want to be buried there, even if there isn't a place to bury them.
Okay, I'm going to stop you there.
Well, I was just going to say, and this is the last point of what is encouraging, and the fact that everything is speeding up. Although there is impunity and there isn't effective action, coalition government's very bad at keeping secrets, and there's much more inquiry into what goes on, even if, as Joseph says, it's not reliable inquiry. So I just wondered if, with all those urban developments in mind, you could say whether you really think communities of interest are shrinking, which would be a bad trend, or perhaps at the same time in other places they're expanding.
Okay, let's go first. I'm going to come to you first, Martin. John Githongo, deluded or not about his potential ability to be a different kind of leader, possibly a popular leader, possibly a politician?
Well, the thing with populism is that it's always open to everybody. Populism is a very open thing. You just need to have the personality and say the things you need to say. So I don't know whether Githongo can reinvent himself. I think we shall get to see if that happens. But I want to challenge this, because I want to say that it's very important that, number one, we don't merely, quote unquote, Africanize this issue. This is a very specific problem about the way states operate, about the way the public sphere is drawn up. This is not so much whether Algeria is also having the same problem or Nigeria is having the same problem. In fact, the cover of the book, and I loved the book actually, doesn't actually need to have an African map on it, because the African map does not speak to the problem. The problem is very specific, and the problem I would put to you has a lot to do with the lack of ideas about how we can actually mobilize ourselves. There's too much trust that's put on culture, that, you know, the kids are growing up together, their mobile phones, everyone's calling each other. And then there are these workshops that you go to in Nairobi, and everyone sits there and says very pretty things. But we are all forgetting a very specific history, and that's a history of organizing, and that's a history of interests. That's a history Kenya has had. Kenya's independence, to no small extent, was agitated for by trade unions, and trade unions that thought their calling was more than merely getting higher salaries for their members. One of the biggest things that's happened recently has been the teachers' strike. There was a teachers' strike in Kenya that had every ethnic group teacher striking at the same time, resisting government pressure, resisting government bribes, resisting forceful and violent arrest. Well, they were fighting for their salaries. So the question is, why is the teachers' union, which is in contact with students and young people all the time, why does it focus and narrow itself down in this sense? And to answer that question is to actually approach a solution and to approach the problem that's going on in Kenya right now. So the issue is not so much whether Githongo can organize himself. Well, Githongo is not going, whether he becomes a populist or not, the question will be, what is the content of his populism? Is it merely moral appeals to stop corruption? Or is it, in fact, an assertion of ideas about our interests are being destroyed and are being turned back by the corrupt? The issue is not corruption. The issue is, what is corruption doing to our interests? And as long as that is not articulated, you have nothing going. And so it's very important to do that. And I'll say finally, there's a model in Nairobi, and it's Nairobi. There are two things you can do. You can hold a workshop or give a speech, right? And what has been happening is that our model of workshopping is built on a kind of London thing, which is if you're demos or some think tank around here, you come up with some terrific paper, and then you then appeal to the minister in the docket that you want to think. Then you get lots of people to write little letters to their MPs, and you then feel things are moving along. The problem with Kenya is that we need far more radical action than that. And so that people are going to have to accept and invite actual radical politics. Because in fact, we're in a radical situation. But we're in a radical situation, a negative radical situation, where we're still talking of solutions in this mealy-mouthed, incremental way, when we are dying, actually. So it seems to me that the issue is not whether Githongo is populist. The challenge for Githongo is what set of ideas around interests can he put together in the places that he's working that actually gets people moving. And after that, you throw in a little dash of demagoguery, and you're home free.
But isn't the danger with that? You see, you're in a radical situation. You need a radical solution. Well, a radical solution normally means a revolution, and a revolution means violence. And so what kind of radical solution can you come? Because the thing about the workshops and all the rest of it, yes, it's gradualist. But hey, the alternative to gradualist is sudden, a sudden eruption. Wouldn't that be the worst possible thing to happen?
Well, I'm forced by the fact that bad things happen suddenly and violently to say, yes, that would be a terrible thing to happen. However, I'll just give you a quick formula, which Joseph spoke about. Joseph spoke about, you rig an election, the militias hit the road, they're paid for. Nairobi, in fact, nowadays you even have to pay for riots, right? You actually pay people to riot. And so you organize the militias and you pay them. They get you into the coalition government. You go into the coalition government and steal, and the people who used to be in your militia starve, right? This is the thing. So there's a kind of revolution of negativity and death from their side, right? On this other side, there's the appeal to incrementalism. Now, my main question was, and we were talking with John earlier, in a year ago in January, why didn't hungry people in Kawangware storm into Lavington where there's lots of food? Why didn't they storm into, I mean, they definitely stormed into their neighbors' houses, right? They burnt their neighbors' houses. So why is there this psychological wall between the rich and the poor? And I am suggesting not that the rich should be strung up or anything like that, but I'm suggesting as long as this wall is maintained in Kenyan life, you cannot in fact have a change. They will not actually reform themselves, provided they are always at a distance from the consequences of their actions.
Okay, Joseph, can you respond on that?
Yeah, I think what I would say about Githongo is that he's a very brave man. Brave in the sense that I have seen the likes of what Githongo does, people in Kenya's history. I have in mind especially people like J.M. Kariuki, who had the means to effect change and in society, but ended up very badly. So that's one thing. The other thing
He ended up dead.
Well,
he
yes.
ended up assassinated, for those who don't know.
No, in Kenya we don't say dead. He just ended up very badly, in a very bad situation. So I think he's aware of that. The other thing is that the reality about Kenya today is that you've got to negotiate. You've got to negotiate issues of ethnicity. You've got to negotiate regionalism. all the factors that come out in Michela's book are still there. If anything, people become much more entrenched, have retreated back into their ethnic and regional pigeonholes. That's the reality. I find it impossible these days to go to a bar and have a proper sort of very open conversation with people, with colleagues and peers, because even people who are extremely well educated will suddenly see things in black and white. Oh no, if it's so and so and he comes from this place, he holds this particular view, we cannot do that. So that's one of the things that is good to negotiate, and it's difficult. The other thing is that I have a sense that Kenya is going to almost the Nigeria level of political godfatherism, whereas to be a politician, to win a constituency, you will have to have the approval of certain committees, cliques, militias, whoever these power brokers be. And that's a very dangerous thing, because then it's democracy held hostage. But then the final point is that, as I said at the beginning, Kenyans don't know where to turn to. They thought the problem was Moi. Let's get rid of him. They did, and unanimously, and he's gone. Let's bring in Kibaki. And there are still problems. Oh no, the problem is power, too much power is concentrated in the hands of one man. So let's split it up. And they devise a prime minister. Problem hasn't gone away. They're not addressing the problem. And I also share, one thing that Martin says is that whatever Kenya needs now has got to be it's got to be a jolt in the system. And I'm not talking about political coups. We're not actually very good at coups. We tried one in not me. They did one in 1982. I was indeed. And they got it horribly wrong. We had a guy who ruled the country for a few hours on a Sunday morning. And so we're not very good at that. But it's a very highly sophisticated society, as Professor is saying. And whatever revolution schemes you come up with, the eaters will also evolve with the times. They will come up with things that they'll put little obstacles. So I can see, Githongo will run the race, but I tell you, we're very good at, running around the tracks and so on, but we do put a few things here to trip up people. So it's a long way to go. But someone has got to speak to the young people, which is where a lot of Kenyans feel that the hope might be. I don't know to what extent issues and problems of ethnicity have sunk in. Michela mentioned that there are people who are growing up, certain generations who see themselves truly and purely as Kenyans. People I speak to, and we don't know who's going to tap into this and how. But it's a tough one.
Thank you, Michela. Drawing on from your question, do you? Our questioner here pointed up lots of sort of some of the more optimistic or hopeful things in your book. Do you derive optimism from that, and do you see a future for your hero or anti-hero?
This is kind of ironic, given that I wrote the book, but I think we should reach a stage where whether or not John Githongo stands for politics, which I gather is something he's considering. It doesn't really matter that much. I'm not that interested myself in it. I think this is somebody who did something remarkable, who broke the mold of what you're supposed to do if you're in government and civil servant, and a minister comes to you and says this is the deal, this is the corrupt deal. And I think he did something incredibly important, because he said, well, sorry, but I have personal principles that make it impossible for me to do that. And by the way, I'm going to expose you, and I'm also going to collect the evidence. So huge kudos where it's due. But I think I've sort of read great paeans of praise to John Githongo, comparing him to Gandhi and people like that, Obama. I mean, God knows what the guy's going to do. I'm sure it's going to be interesting and worth following. But I think the point is he set a precedent, but there are other Kenyans who have also done similar things. I mean, I talk in my book about David Munyike, who was a lowly bank clerk who didn't enjoy John Githongo's privileges of birth and position, who actually exposed Goldenberg. He was just a small guy. He was an illegitimate son of a prison warden, and he did it, and he paid a very high price, and ended up sort of dying of TB in a godforsaken hospital in Iraq. I've met someone else when I was doing the book who had worked at the KCC, the Anti-Corruption Authority, And similarly, not someone who's high up in the rankings, not a politician, not John Githongo, not a permanent secretary whose story got in the public headlines, and who had seen something happen and borne witness to something that made it clear that the KACC, was completely untrustworthy and riddled with its own form of corruption, and went public with that. And it was just his own personal thing of, I cannot live with myself if I see this happen. And I think that's one of the points. You have to look at Kenya and think there are many other Kenyans who are going to be behaving like this in future, and one has to hope more and more and more. And therefore, I'm not too bothered, really, what John Githongo does in the future. He's certainly going to be collecting headlines. But for me, what mattered was that he did break the mold, and he encouraged all the other people who are trying to do that, and often at much greater risk to themselves, and made them see that that was a possible path to follow.
Thanks very much. Professor Loza, what I think, it was quite a while back now, your question, but my recollection of it was that you'd pointed to some of these more optimistic things in Michela's book and sort of suggested that by just saying the cities were an exception on this ethnic divisionism, you were dismissing rather a large part of the Kenyan population there.
It's true. It's an increasingly large section of the population, and it's true. I mean, you drew attention to Michela's chapter on Sheng, which is absolutely fascinating. Sheng being a patois of the streets, which is partly Swahili, partly other ethnic vernaculars, partly English. My only objection to Sheng is that they call all Europeans kaburu now. And 50 years ago, kaburu meant very specifically a Boer farmer, or else in the Kikuyu Bible meant the Egyptian taskmasters who gave the children of Israel a hard time under Pharaoh. And I resent being called a kaburu in that sense. Otherwise, it seems to me Sheng is an altogether extremely promising development. As far as sense of community is concerned, I think one just draws very contrasting pictures. On the one hand, at this conference I was at in January, historians said, look, we've got a hideous history, but we've also got a very courageous history. And the people we really want to know about from a year ago are those people who helped ethnic neighbors in the slums to survive, who hid them from death squads and so on. And there was a great deal of neighborly courage shown in slums, and not only in slums, but also with perhaps still more courage out in some of the rural areas. But I was talking about this with Martin over a beer before this meeting, and he thought that nonetheless one can also show where ethnic villages are growing up in sort of self-defense within the slums. So it seems to me it's a very variegated picture. One can point to some growth of the sense of being Kenyan. One can show where people are withdrawing from that. My best time in Nairobi was spent on a Sunday morning in Ziwani, one of the, it's not exactly a slum, but it's not a wealthy area, in African Inland Church. The only thing you need to survive Kenyan church services is a very strong bladder. They go on 3, 4, 5 hours. And what was remarkable about this, apart from its longevity, was the fact that while the African Inland Church is historically, at least by origin, a Kamba church, one of the many ethnic groups, the person leading the service was Kalenjin. The fire and brimstone preacher was a Luo. There were 2 choirs, one Luo, one Kikuyu, all jiving for Jesus with incredible enthusiasm. And one really felt, one was in a Kenyan church here. Not a Kamba church, not a Kikuyu church, not a Luo church, but a Kenyan church. So one can point to the growth of a Kenyan public. One can also point, sadly, to withdrawal from that. What the future
okay, thank you. Thanks very much. Okay. Right, and you're still at the back with your hand up, yes. Gentleman with the scarf.
My name's Charles Larkham. Also, I am a Kenyan. Grew up in Kenya, though I've been living away from the country for well over 20 years. I really want to just make 1 or 2 observations. I'll try and keep them brief. I go back to Kenya twice a year, 2 or 3 times a year. I was out there in December this year, and I heard that Hilary Ngweno, who's one of the well-known local editors in Kenya, had produced a CD documentary. And I was really quite interested to watch it, because he has a reputation in the past of being quite insightful. And what really struck me was how superficial the politics in Kenya are, and that it was just really a question of musical chairs. And so I think really in that context, John Githongo and others, I think they're rightly focusing on corruption, but I don't think corruption is fundamentally the issue. I think corruption is a symptom of an absence of authentic leadership in the country. And the question is, how does Kenya break away from this? I don't pretend to have a solution. I think that the country's got so much going for it. I think the risk of it going down the tubes in the sort of corruption way that Nigeria has is not as bad. But I think there are some real challenges, and the question is, how does the country move away from where it is to a state much better than it is? I think the idea of awarding parliamentarians such lavish salaries at the top end of the world, I think, is pretty outrageous. But I'm an optimist. I think that the country, Kenya, will find its way. I think we all kid ourselves if we think the solution is a short-term one. I think we need to look for a medium-term, longer-term sort of solution.
Okay, thank you very much. Does anybody else? Oh, yes, they're all coming up now. There's 2 there. Lady on the far left with the ponytail.
Hi, I'm Sanara Vet, and I've just come in from Kenya this morning. I've been there for the last 2 years, and my question's mainly for Joseph Warungu. It's about what he said about the media in Kenya, the local media. I've found, just from reading the local newspapers and the radio there, mainly English speaking, that they've actually been very vocal and critical of the government and very insightful. And I think there's a great respect for the media amongst Kenyans, and they read the newspapers a lot and they discuss what's happening. They're very political about chatting to each other. And so I suppose I'm saying 2 things. One, does he not think that there is a section of the media that is being critical and objective about what's going on? And secondly, isn't there a way that the local media can play a role in creating a more positive Kenya and curbing these politicians?
Joseph, do you want to take that?
Yeah, sure. I think what I was speaking to mainly is about the media as an institution. In my opinion, I think it's weakened. It doesn't help that Parliament recently passed a bill that would completely make life very difficult for the media, and enable the state to do whatever it can. And I don't think some of the factors we saw during the political violence that happened in Kenya have completely gone away from, in a sense that the media also allowed themselves to be used by whatever forces were at play. There is certainly a lot of sort of critical self-searching, and the media are raising or speaking out and addressing all these issues. What worries me is that collectively, as an institution, there is an effort by the state to completely cripple or undermine the media in a sense. There is also another quiet development that's happening, which is not spoken a lot about, in the broadcast media. In Moi's time, the problem was the state media, the state broadcaster KBC, very powerful, under the control effectively of the state and State House. Now that changed, but actually what has happened is that you have certain entrepreneurs who've grown up and who have acquired, through whichever means, FM frequencies, and have effectively become, I'm talking about one particular media house, a de facto public service broadcaster. But they are aligned to some of the political players in the field. So it's a very uneven field. And I have a lot of respect for my Kenyan colleagues and journalists, but I know, because I have friends there who are editors and reporters, that they're going through a lot of stress, and conditions are really extremely difficult. life would be a lot easier and they would perhaps play a much active role. I suppose maybe I'm also quite nostalgic of the early 90s when the press was absolutely robust in telling Moi, look, you cannot just have KANU, you have to allow a multi-party system as the wave was sweeping across Africa in the early 90s. So yeah, the media is active, but I just feel that there is a danger that it's going to be crushed or even compromised, perhaps, in a way.
Michela, do you want to come in on that?
I just wanted to make a quick point. I've always been a great admirer of the Kenyan media. I spent 3 months working on a paper there. I had many friends who are journalists there, and I think it's one of the best in Africa, without a doubt. But I think the crisis over the elections really showed one of its weaknesses, because there has been this tradition in Kenya never to talk about which ethnic community you belong to, and that's for a worthy reason, which is, we don't want to exacerbate, the media does not want to exacerbate ethnic self-consciousness. But when you had what was basically a violence that was expressing itself in very obvious ethnic form, this became this sort of strange Orwellian speak that was being used, where all Kenyans knew what was happening, because they know from the names of people who is killing who. But you would never see the words used, and it just became this bizarre situation. I think I ended up feeling, and I've written about this, that actually the media was contributing to the problem, because if you won't name the beast, you can't fight the beast. If you're going to pretend that there isn't an ethnic issue in Kenya today, which sadly there really now is, then you are not going to be able to handle it. And the Kenyan media has continued that policy and don't show any signs of dropping it. And I really think it's now part of the problem. I mean, you have to accept there is a problem there with this conception of it's our turn to eat. It boils down to a problem, not, as the gentleman said, corruption isn't the issue. It's a question of identity, how Kenyans see themselves, whether they associate mostly with their ethnic community or with the nation state. And if you're not going to recognize that, you can't handle it. You can't deal with it.
Thank you very much. There was another lady there. You had a question? Yeah. Hang on, wait. If you wait for the microphone, it's coming your way.
We hadn't got on to Western policy towards Kenya. What do the panelists think Obama and Brown should be doing to make things better, if they can do anything?
Martin, let me give that one to you.
Yeah. Can I just respond just slight detour and then to this one? There's the idea with the media that the truth shall set you free. But Kenyans know the scandals. You cannot at this point surprise or shock Kenyans with any scandal at all. There's nothing politicians can do that will be met with any degree of surprise by any Kenyan with any sense of awareness. So the issue is, once the truth has been said, what does the truth then do? And I'll put it to you that the age of these isms is not yet over. To use a politically incorrect term, tribalism is an ism. It's a kind of form of crude ideology that has an idea about who it represents, what it wants, and the world it wants to live in, and what it wants to do with resources and money, etc., etc. The thing is that tribalism is stepping into the field with no one to challenge it at all. And unless there's somebody to challenge it, it does not matter what articles are printed exposing what. And the reason has been, this workshop culture. I'll come back to this, because literally this thing is horrific, because there's an idea here that the PowerPoint presentation about the reforms Singapore did are really the way to go. Lee Kuan Yew did A, B, C, D, and you then think of change and reform outside of ideology and outside of ideas. And what you then trust in is some kind of big men, and they are men, who then will kind of have a conscience and will try and take you down the Lee Kuan Yew road, down that PowerPoint road. Unfortunately, the PowerPoint is far weaker than the bank account, right? So these facts and these exposés, we've had them, and they could improve, they could even accelerate. It's not going to change anything. You can stand and tell Kenyans it's corrupt till the end of time. It still won't change anything. There has to be a way that these facts fit into some kind of ideological model that attacks the ideology that's presently ruling. These are terms that people are no longer speaking about because supposedly we live in a post-ideological world. I don't believe it. I just don't believe it. But then on the issue of Obama, where Kenya comes down Obama's list is incredibly low. Right? It's just so low. I want to believe otherwise. I want to believe that he gets up thinking of Kogelo but it's just not the fact. So what can Obama do? I wrote some kind of outraged opinion piece in some American publication, and a friend of mine wrote to me and said, so what are you saying? We should stop AIDS medicines from coming? And that stopped me short on my tracks. Like, what really should they do? What levers and sticks does the world have that can actually unsettle the way things are? And I think Michela very nicely, I think, in a very penetrating way. In fact, if there's anything that will really have an effect in your book here, it's the way you look at DFID and the diplomats, and that conflict between where the diplomats are doing one thing, DFID is doing another thing, and the fact that the diplomats, they just can't do anything. All they can do is speak and make speak. So it seems to me that there's going to be very little that the outside world can do. Having said that, just to finish, I think Obama has enormous prestige, and my issue is I don't think his policies are going to be that far different from Bush's vis-a-vis Kenya. The real test of Obama is going to be how does he deal with the approach to 2012, not as a kind of policy, but how much he picks up the phone and how forceful they are in speaking to our ruling class.
Michela, let me pass that one to you.
Well, I just want to say that, if you want to pursue this matter, the man to talk to is Edward Clay, who, has really represented the line of kind of as partners to Kenya, as Western donors. It is the duty of Western governments to be a bit more forceful and not to roll over and say, oh, but the foreign aid program must continue. And I think one of the points I make in my book is that there are underused and underutilized weapons, because you don't have to necessarily cut off AIDS medicines. Nobody wants to do that. But there are weapons to be used, firstly, just by talking. As Martin mentioned, Edward Clay became a hero in Kenya for his vomit speech. And he gave more than one. There was Vomit 1 and Vomit 2. And his successor, I don't believe, has given very many Vomit 3 or 4 or 5. So I would say, we need more vomit speeches. And there are other tools that can be used that stop short of depriving Kenyan people of medicines and schools. There is the force of humiliation. One of the things that has really annoyed the kind of ministers who are really at the heart of all these corruption scandals is discovering that they can't travel to London and go shopping in Harrods because they aren't on a visa ban list, and they can't go to America and swan around Manhattan for the same reason. And these little facts have been leaked to the Kenyan media, and it's extremely clever because it identifies these people in the eyes of their own public, it humiliates them in the eyes of their peers. And this is one of the problems we have, that there is a whole political class that doesn't regard it as shameful that one of their members is fingered as being massively corrupt. Well, it is somewhat humiliating if you can't take your wife to Harrods to shop till she drops. So I think there are small things that can be done. Overall, I have to say, I am pessimistic, because what we're seeing, and you have to look at the strategic situation in Eastern Africa, is that you have Somalia is falling apart. Sudan is on the brink. Eritrea and Ethiopia could end up going to war any moment. You have the whole of the Horn of Africa looking extremely perilous, and then you also have Congo. Now, if you're a Western government, and if you're Obama, who really isn't that interested in Africa, despite being half Kenyan himself, and you want to have a steady partner, you're going to be looking towards Kenya and Ethiopia as your partners. And you are going to do that old diplomatic reasoning, which is he may be a bastard, speaking of Kibaki and his cronies, but he's our bastard. He's a reliable bastard. The fact that the last elections proved that this was complete codswallop and has proved it throughout history with every dictator we've ever seen in Africa from Mobutu onwards, isn't going to stop the Obama administration or the Gordon Brown administration thinking in those terms. And so the tendency and the temptation will always be, okay, they're corrupt, but hey, you know, look what's happening in Somalia, we need a friend in the region. And so there is always this inbuilt tendency of the West to go along with whichever crook is in power in a place like Kenya of the day.
It's quite interesting you saying that. Makes me think, you know, tomorrow is the day that the International Criminal Court is probably going to put out an arrest warrant for President Bashir of Sudan. So I wonder if we need an International Criminal Court which has corruption as well as genocide on its list of crimes which can be punished internationally. I'm going to abuse my position again. Since we have got you there, Edward Clay, I can see you, you can't hide. Can you just tell us briefly, what do you think Gordon Brown, Obama, powerful nations should be doing about Kenya?
Well, thank you. The British government wouldn't send me back to be their High Commissioner to Kenya, and if they did, the Kenya government wouldn't receive me. So I hope you'll just bear that in mind. These views are strictly personal. But in trying to make my own intervention in 2004 and 2005, I was much more conscious of the perils of intervening at all in terms of the local impact that I might have and the risk of being misunderstood, or perhaps misunderstood, but anyway, not interpreted in the way I wanted to be. But I think there are two points of tangency for Kenya's development partners and Kenya in this question of corruption. And they're ones that I think we have begun to exploit. One is that Kenyans are very hard-headed people. And what they don't understand is why we say one thing about governance or about anything else, actually, but then go around lashing up people they know to be associated with the opposite. It seems to me that probably Kenya governments need their outside friends a bit more than their friends need them. And we could afford to be more direct in saying, this is the kind of conduct really which is not pleasing to your people, it's not pleasing to us either. And your taxpayers and our taxpayers actually have a common interest, particularly now. You know, that argument is going to be made more forcefully willy-nilly. And secondly, I think that the money is more or less irrelevant for the donors, to whom it is still relatively small potatoes. Well, it's very big potatoes in Kenya, but what is much more important is the effect that corruption has on society and on institutions. And the robbery is not only of the money, but it's of the confidence or the trust that people should have in their governments. And in the end, the "our bastard" argument doesn't work, because they don't become good or effective partners in whatever, you know, wider scheme we would like poor governments to assist us in. So I think we just have to recognize that also. But I am, on the whole, an optimist. And I like the conclusion which Githongo has drawn so far anyway, that is that we need to address ourselves more to the people. If we can, that seems rather improbable from, you know, a northern diplomat living in conditions of great privilege in Nairobi, but who knows? If you try, it might have an impact.
Thank you very much. I'm going to start to draw this to a close, but are there any more questions and comments from the floor? I can see a gentleman there in the grey sweater.
This is for Professor Lonsdale. I was reading your wealth, poverty, and civic virtue, right? And you've got a really hopeful section at the end about how.
Can you speak into the microphone because we can't hear you?
Yes, he has a really hopeful section at the end about how the way out of the ethnic morass is by getting people to sort of reveal to each other their sort of moral ethnicities, in the hope that some commonalities can be found. I mean, do you still think this is a promising path?
Okay, Professor Lonsdale.
Well, I congratulate you on your industry in getting that far.
He missed out the earlier chapters.
There is no doubt that in general Kenyan public speech, whether it's in bars or in matatus or wherever, or as I like to imagine myself, under the stars in Siaya in Western Kenya with a good glass of busar or something else, quite strong. That people are very well aware of the appalling contrast between the kind of moral behavior that they expect of friends and neighbors, which is that they should have reciprocal obligations to each other, however unequal they are in terms of wealth and status. But that there are really quite strict rules in which people should behave. And those, their knowledge of the way in which those rules are broken by those people who purport to speak for them in the field of government, but who nonetheless have to be tolerated because this is the only way in which you can get at the power of the state. And people realize that the power of the state, the way in which it distributes largesse, at least to its favored allies, can be extraordinarily important. And I think there's an acute conscience of the extraordinary sort of disjuncture between the kind of behavior that people expect of each other locally and those which they are perforce forced to tolerate from those on high. So it seems to me that there is a perpetual kind of moral impasse, I think, which if anyone could break through, might have quite extraordinary effects.
Okay, any more contributions before I go back? All right, we're still, yes, all right. Gentleman down here.
Hi, name is Nirav. I'm from Kenya as well. Sorry, I can't remember your name, gentleman on the left. I'm sorry, I never listen to names. Just coming back to point you were saying about how in Kenya we generally think of our leaders as the ones who should take the way. And so voted out Moi, that didn't solve the problem. Tried to vote out Kibaki, that didn't solve the problem. Isn't actually that the problem, that we always look to something really big and high? We try and look to political characters to sort all our problems out. We look to the media, we look to all these other things. And actually I've done a lot of work in slums in Nairobi, and it's always about what what the Mzungu can do. It was very rarely about what you can actually do for yourself. What I think when I was actually working, trying to get some industries to invest in some of the infrastructure in slums in Nairobi, one industrialist just told me, just come to my place this Saturday. I'll show you what we're doing. And what he showed me there was he'd implemented this thing called the Kaizen method of efficiency improvement. I can't remember what exactly you call it, whereby it's actually famously used by Toyota of Japan, other Japanese industries, whereby you actually teach basically everyone in your workforce, from the very top people to the very bottom people, all about how to improve their well-being, everything they're doing, their work. They all think about absolutely everything they're doing and how it affects the company and how it affects everything else. And things like this just you don't have to give someone money. They realize the fact that, for example, in Kibera in Nairobi, the government is spending, can't remember, about 1 million shillings. There are approximately 1 million people in Kibera. If they just each spend 1 shilling, that would already be the amount. They already have that ability to do what they can do.
Okay, I'm going to ask you to wrap up there, because I think there was one other, yes, the lady there, and then I'm going to go back to the panel.
Yeah, Anna Matheson, it's just a question to the panel. You all mentioned this kind of idea of oncoming doom, and in particular you mentioned 2012 as kind of the time when it could catapult. I was just wondering if anyone had any ideas about kind of earlier triggers that could happen. For instance, the possibility that the ICC could get involved with trying those who were involved in the violence last year. So if there are any other indicators that you think it could happen sooner, the violence could escalate.
Okay, well, I'll take that question and use that as a way of getting everybody to wrap up. So I'm going to go in a random order and ask you first that question. Triggers, things which could happen between now and 2012, things you're concerned about. And also, I think the most important thing, what needs to happen before 2012, the next elections, to try and make sure that we don't get the kind of explosion of violence that we had last time. Joseph, let me start with you.
Just on the question quickly, I think the international court is one route, but even that has got its own hidden dangers, and that's one thing that some Kenyans are wary of. Depending on how you carry out that legal process, there could be ramifications from certain communities. It's just something to bear in mind. I think the other thing is that Kofi Annan and co, when they were coming up with this coalition, it was not meant to last till 2012. This was a transitional government, but it turned out to be a Somali type of transitional government, which go on for 12 years. And I think that's why people are kind of running out of steam. We've got some of the things that were agreed on, which are not implemented. Amongst them is a review of the constitution, a proper independent electoral commission and that sort of thing, and people are still, holding up for that. But for me, sort of in summary, last month, the government went to great expense to lay out a huge workshop called The Kenya We Want. And they invited all sorts of people, and it was the biggest public joke I've ever seen. And the joke was on the government, because they are the only people who could not see. Every single Kenyan knows what sort of Kenya they want, but these guys had to have this whole workshop, and they'll go around the country collecting opinions. And what Kenyans were saying is that it's not the Kenya we want, it's the Kenyans we want, and they don't look like you. And I have a lot of faith in Kenyan people. They're very innovative. They're very creative. They're very stoic as well. They will survive through this. Like we're asking in Britain, are we at the bottom there? Are we there yet? I don't think we are. But Kenya will come out of this somehow. I think what they're looking for is some kind of a vision, something that channels all the energies together and rallies everybody. I don't know whether that's Githongo or whether that's something else. That is missing, and they don't know what it is. Whether the politics has failed them completely, I don't know, because 2012 is not really the answer. The people I see lining up for 2012 from all the communities are people I could actually write their speeches right now, because it's the very same faces we've seen, the same policies. So politics hasn't quite changed. The plates may move around, the dinner plates a little bit, but things haven't changed. So it's one of the triggers will be the ICC, but I don't know. The only thing I'm quite a doomsayer. People learned a lot from the last violence. If it happens again, this will be the end of that country. Because everybody is armed and prepared and knows that it will not be about playing about it. It's going to be the defense of the self, the family, and so on. So no one is going to get caught out or unprepared. So everybody is conscious that they should not get to that 2012 or that pitfall. It's really very precarious at the moment. Everybody you speak to, I have guys very honorable journalists who travel, and you open the boot of their car and there's a machete there. And what's this for? Do you need this to replace your tire? no, you never know. They say so. It's quite worrying for Kenyans.
Okay, Professor Lonso, let me pass to you between now and 2012.
Well, I'm a historian, and the past is my country, not the future. But I don't want to completely cop out. It seems to me that what Anna suggested, should the ICC be involved, that would, I think, be one of the ways in which violence could be triggered, in that anybody who was hauled up before it would call on, I think, their ethnic cohorts to defend them. But as Lindsay said in answer to an earlier question, violence does depend on being stirred up. And it seems to me that somehow, and I don't know how, the tendency to stir up violence has somehow to be curbed. And but that it seems to me is a very quixotic thing to suggest, because there are just so many young unemployed men who are very prepared to be recruited as militias, who have a considerable interest in the exercise of violence in the expectation of reward. I am extremely alarmed, but no more alarmed, I'm afraid, than my Kenyan friends.
Martin, to you.
Well, I also don't know what's going to happen up to 2012. I suspect that the ICC would move very slowly on investigating this, even if they got it. They have a lot on their plate. It's starting to look like an African court. And, you've got to first eat Bashir before you can get to the Kenyans. So that's going to be quite a meal for them. And I doubt that their appetite will be that sharp for another one. But indeed, like John thinks, I think the ICC getting involved is going to basically mean, if I was indicted in the ICC in the present atmosphere, I would pay some young men to go and kill in whatever kind of very visible and horrific fashion a group of people, and I would say, come near me and the place will burn. And
we all thought that you'd just say, have a workshop.
Yeah, have a workshop. So this is, so for me, my hope is not in any solution being found between 2012. I actually just want us to survive 2012. And then after that, we can start to think of other things to do. We just need to actually survive up to 2012. And it seems to me that we're going either way. This idea of avoiding violence, I really need to say this, and please don't get me wrong. We're not going to avoid violence. It's coming. The question is, how much of it is it going to be, and how much will it tear a hole in our middle? That's really going to be the question, because this thing we keep calling ethnic rivalry, ethnic hatred, whatever label you want to put on it, the thing in Kenya is that it's all incredibly attracted to the center. There's none of it that's actually saying, we just want to go our own way. People just want to come to the center. People, you machete your way to Nairobi, right? And in fact, the day changes. The day you machete yourself out is the day the real problem will come. And of course, it needs to be said that one of the great pieces of luck we had last year was that, for example, there was no enemy outside Kenya that wanted to use the opportunity to take advantage of it, because the Horn of Africa is the region of the proxy of the proxy war. And the fact that we didn't have enemies meant that this movement just didn't have the other factor that comes in the Horn. And it seems to me that factor is not going to come in. So I suspect we have a series of clashes, and I can't know how intense they'll be. I can't know what they'll do, but I feel that they'll be there come 2012. And so for me, the challenge is going to be not merely the moral ideas, but in fact, how much people can actually get down and organize actual, for lack of a better word, movements or groups that actually have some kind of cross-cutting character and that have some interests. They won't solve the problems by 2012, but maybe you'll be building on something that Kenyans have already built on, and that can in fact see us through over the next decade or so.
Michela.
No, isn't it depressing that we're sitting here talking about elections being such a problem, multi-party elections, that they have ironically become this terrible, frightening, future event in the future in Kenya, waiting for Kenya. But I mean, I don't know what the trigger will be. I mean, I've become a great critic of the ICC, having seen its work across Africa, and just feeling that it doesn't help. It actually does a lot of damage and throws petrol onto various fires that are simmering there. From what I'm hearing from people in Kenya, long before the ICC plays any role, we may see sort of street protests, hunger, riots, I don't know, strikes getting out of hand. It seems that the level of anger and hunger in Kenya is so extreme that these things, which certainly never used to be things people used to speculate about before in Kenya, are now possible. I do think people now in the international community should be thinking about how you stage these awful, frightening elections that are coming up. Because the one thing, there were several lessons from the last elections. One lesson was that it doesn't really matter how many votes are cast and who they're cast for. That's not going to determine who rules Kenya. But the other thing is everyone's learned how to rig an election in Kenya. They now know how to do it. They know the techniques. They know what are the pressure points. And they're going to be preparing to do exactly that. So, I mean, obviously you're going to have these things, organized by the UN or organized by some. I mean, I think there will have to be military observers at the polling places myself. So I think we should be thinking about that now, because that's coming up quite soon. So I'm afraid I'm as gloomy as everyone at this event. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm afraid we've left this on a bleak note, but I think that was inevitable because things are very precarious in Kenya, but at least this is a room of people who care about it. So it just leaves me to thank our panelists, to tell you to go and buy Michela's book, Professor Lonsdale's book. It's high time that Joseph and Martin wrote books for you to buy as well. And also have a glass of wine or a beer and, I don't know, pray for Kenya.